There's a record I almost missed. It was a marriage contract, not a baptism, not a burial. One man, one signature, but two completely different last names in the same sentence, filed by a notary who saw nothing strange about it at all. For about 10 minutes, I thought I'd found two separate families that happened to share a wedding day. I hadn't. What I'd actually found was the reason a family swearing they'd been Catholic and French Canadian for generations couldn't produce a single record to prove it, at least not under the name they thought they carried. And once you know what to look for, you'll start seeing this exact trick hiding in your own tree, too. Let's dive in. Welcome to Ancestors and Algorithms, where family history meets artificial intelligence. I'm your host, Brian, and today we're heading into Quebec and then following one family south into the mill towns of New England. Now, if you don't have a drop of French Canadian blood in your tree, stick around anyway. The puzzle at the center of this episode, a name that quietly split into two, shows up in Irish trees, German trees, Italian trees, in almost every immigrant story we've ever covered on this show. You haven't had a word for it yet. By the end of today, you will, and you'll know exactly which record to go find once you suspect it's happening to you. This one also happens to be a first for the show. We've done Irish parishes, German churches, even Mexican civil registration. We've never once opened a Quebec notarial file, and after today, I don't think we'll be able to avoid it again. So let's get into it. I want you to meet a woman I'm calling Denise. She's a composite built from a pattern I've seen play out in more French Canadian family trees than I can count. Her question is real, though, and I'd guess a few of you have asked some version of it yourselves. Denise owns her great-great-grandmother's rosary. The beads are worn smooth from decades of handling. On the back of the small medal at the end, someone once scratched a name into the metal, probably with a pin or a nail. La Chance. Her family always told the same story about that name. They came from Quebec sometime in the 1880s. They settled in Woonsocket, Rhode Island. They went to work in the textile mills, same as nearly 1 million other French Canadians who crossed that border by 1930. They were chasing wages the family farm back home could never match. That part of the story checked out fast. The 1900 census shows the family in Woonsocket. Parents born in Canada. French listed as the mother tongue. Father and 2 teenage sons all working the same mill. Denise had already matched that record to her tree on her own, months before she ever talked to me. Exactly what she expected to find, right where she expected to find it. Woonsocket wasn't unusual for this story. Whole neighborhoods across New England, in Lowell, in Manchester, in a dozen mill cities like them, filled up with French-speaking newcomers and became what everyone at the time called a Little Canada. Its own parish, its own school, its own French-language newspaper, sometimes its own credit union. A family could live an entire life in one of these neighborhoods and barely need English at all. That's the world Denise's people stepped into. It wasn't, however, the world she needed answers from. She needed the parish they'd left behind. Then she tried to go further back into Quebec itself, into the parish the family had supposedly left. And here's where I want you to lean in for a second, because I know some of you have been exactly here. You have a surname. You have a place. You have a rough decade to search around. You've got the confidence of a solid 20th century paper trail behind you, and the records right before it refused to connect. Denise searched the baptismal registers for La Chance in the parish of Saint Jean-Baptiste de Nicolet on the south shore of St. Lawrence across from Trois-Rivières. Quebec has one of the best kept vital record traditions anywhere in North America. Catholic parishes here have recorded baptism, marriages, and burials since 1621, and most of that stretch survives, digitized, and searchable. Denise knew this. It's part of why the wall she hit felt so wrong. She found LaChante's baptism starting around 1850. She found LaChante's marriages and burials from that point on too, right through to the family's departure for Rhode Island. Before 1850, in that same parish, over the exact decades her family swore they'd already been there, the surname LaChance does not appear once. A less experienced researcher might decide the family came from somewhere else entirely, and that the Quebec connection was a nice story with no paper behind it. Denise's own first instinct went even further. She wondered if her family had quietly picked up a French Canadian identity that was never really theirs, the way some families do, whether they mean to or not. What she really wanted wasn't a fact. It was permission to trust the story her grandmother told her, the one she was already planning to tell her own kids. That's not a foolish worry. Family stories drift over 4 generations. And the Milltown years didn't leave much room for careful record keeping either. French Canadian workers in those Rhode Island mills often earned less than their neighbors, lived in crowded company housing, and had children working the same floor by age 10 or 12. Nobody in that house was sitting down to write a careful family history. They were surviving a shift. So a little drift in the story, by the time it reached Denise, would have been an easy thing to forgive. But I wasn't ready to throw out 2 centuries of oral tradition on the strength of one missing generation. So before Denise gave up on Quebec entirely, I wanted to test the wall properly. This is exactly the kind of moment where AI earns a place in your research, and I want to be specific about what I mean by that. AI doesn't know Denise's family. It can't invent a connection between 2 names that isn't actually there. What it can do is help us search, organize, and compare faster than we'd manage alone on a Saturday afternoon, working through record sets a single researcher could spend a month sorting by hand. That's the whole philosophy behind the show, and you'll hear me say it a couple more times today. AI is your research assistant, not your researcher. So here's the question we're chasing for the rest of this episode. The rosary said LaChance. The family swore they had always been LaChance. Why couldn't we find a single LaChance baptism in that parish before 1850? I'm going to walk you through exactly how this one got solved, or mostly solved. Follow along, because this same approach works whether your walls sit in Quebec, in County Cork, in Bavaria, or 3 towns over from wherever you're sitting right now. Here's what I did first. I could have kept scrolling through parish register images, hoping something would jump out at me. Plenty of genealogists spend an entire weekend doing exactly that, squinting at page after page of a priest's cramped handwriting. But I already had a decent pile of LaChance events from Denise's own research. A couple dozen baptisms, marriages, and burials spanning 1750 to 1900 already transcribed into a spreadsheet. What I needed wasn't another search. I needed a second set of eyes on the pattern already sitting in front of me. This is a distinction worth sitting with for a second because it trips people up constantly. A lot of genealogists reach for AI the same way they'd reach for a search engine, typing in a name and hoping something useful falls out. That's not what any of these tools do best. Claude's real strength is reasoning across information you hand it directly, spotting a pattern, comparing documents, noticing what a human eye skims past after the 10th similar-looking baptism entry in a row. I already had the raw material. I needed the pattern recognition. That's why Claude, and not a search engine of any kind, was the right first move. Here's the prompt I used. Quote, I have a baptism, marriage, and burial entries for the surname LaChance in the parish of Saint Jean-Baptiste de Nicolet, Quebec, spanning 1750 to 1900. Here is the list I've compiled, list of dated events. Build a timeline showing these events by decade. Note the earliest event you can find under this surname and flag whether a sudden, clean starting point like this is more consistent with a family arriving from elsewhere or with a family that was already present under a different name, end quote. I gave it every date I had. Claude laid the whole thing out by decade, and the shape of it was immediately telling. Nothing under Lachance before 1850. Then, starting that decade, baptisms, marriages, and burials all at once at a completely normal rhythm for an established Catholic farming family. 8 or 9 baptisms a decade right through to the 1880s. Claude's read on the pattern matched mine, and it said something worth repeating on air. A surname that starts abruptly with no earlier stray appearances at all rarely belongs to a family that arrived only recently. New arrivals to an established parish usually show up gradually in a marriage record or a land transaction before the baptism start. A clean, sudden start like this one usually means the family was already there the whole time, under a name we hadn't thought to search for yet. I'll admit, my first instinct was DNA. Wouldn't it be faster to find a few Quebec cousins through a match and let them hand us the connection directly? I actually considered starting there. A lot of researchers reach for DNA the moment a paper trail gets stubborn, and most of the time that's a perfectly good instinct. But without knowing which surname thread was even correct, a match to some unrelated Lachance or Pepin family in the same region would have added noise, not clarity. I'd have no reliable way to tell a genuine cousin from a coincidence built on a common surname in a shared region. Better to settle the paper trail first and bring DNA in later if we still needed it to confirm the connection. I set that idea aside for now and moved on with the records I already had in hand. This is also the moment where casting a wider net matters more than searching harder in the same place. Most people, when a search comes up empty, repeat the same search over and over with more patience. The real move is realizing the record you need might not be sitting in the collection you've already searched 5 times. Sometimes it's sitting in a collection you didn't know existed yet. Here's the thing about a surname that starts that cleanly, with no earlier stray mentions anywhere in a parish this well documented. It almost never means the family arrived from somewhere else right at that moment. Far more often, it means the family was there all along, sitting right there in the register, filed under something else. So I went looking for what that something else might be. I'll be honest, at this point I didn't know what I was looking for yet. I only knew the shape of the hole it needed to fill, something specific to Quebec, something that could make an entire surname appear out of nowhere in a parish register, with the family behind it already established, already Catholic, already local in every other way. French-Canadian genealogy has a habit almost nobody outside Quebec has heard of, one that probably explains more brick walls in this specific kind of research than any single record type I can think of. In Quebec genealogy, there's a tradition called the D name. D means said or called. Back in the regiments of New France and for generations afterwards, a family already carrying a common surname would pick up a second, unofficial one. Sometimes it came from a nickname, sometimes from a place of origin, or a physical trait, or old military service. A parish full of Lachances or Tremblays or Gagnons needed a way to tell branches of the same family apart, and the D name did that job. These pairings are documented all over Quebec's genealogical record. A family named Sauvé carried the name Laplante alongside it for generations. A family named Pelletier picked up Bellefleur the same way. Some families used both names side by side for a century. Some eventually dropped the original altogether and never looked back. A priest recording a baptism might reach for either one, depending on the year, the family, or honestly, whichever name he happened to be used to hearing that week from that particular household. If that's what's happened here, this family might be sitting in the record right now under a completely different surname, one that looks like it has nothing to do with Lachance on the page, even though it's the exact same people in the exact same pew on the exact same Sunday. I went looking for a real reference tool that tracks these D name pairings, the kind genealogists actually use for this exact problem. The nickname association search on the PRDH-IGD database and the American French Genealogy Society's online D name list. I typed in Lachance. It turned up a document pairing I hadn't expected. Pepin de Lachance. Not Denise's family specifically, only a known cataloged association between the two surnames, the kind of clue that earns a closer look rather than a conclusion. So I went back into the parish registers, this time searching Pepin baptisms in Nicolet before 1850. And here's our dead end for the day. There were Pepin baptisms, a lot of them, spread across a dozen or more households. Pepin, it turns out, is about as common a surname in that region as Smith is here. I had 7 candidate Pepin families baptizing children in the right years, in the right parish, with no clean way to tell which one, if any, was the family that would eventually go by Lachance alone. This is where I went back to Claude, and it's a good example of tool chaining, taking what one AI produced and feeding it straight into the next question, instead of starting from scratch with a brand new tool. I already had the godparents and witnesses attached to the confirmed Lachance baptisms from after 1850. I asked Claude to compare those names against the godparents and witnesses listed on each of the 7 candidate Pepin families, and to flag any names that repeated across both groups, since repeated godparents in this era usually point to the same extended family standing up for each other's children, generation after generation. 3 names repeated across both lists, but only for one of the 7 Pepin families. That narrowed 7 candidates down to one strong contender. Strong, but not proof. Neighbors and friends share godparents too, not only relatives. I needed something that named the connection directly, in plain writing, not a pattern I was inferring from circumstantial overlap. This is where I turn to a record type this show has never featured before, the Quebec notarial contract. Quebec's legal system runs on civil law, not common law, a legacy of its French origins that most American researchers never encounter anywhere else in their tree. For nearly 400 years, a notary, not a court, handled marriage contracts, wills, and property settlements for ordinary families, farmers, and mill hands included, not only the wealthy. Notaries in Quebec have kept these records since 1626, filed away in what's called a greffe. After a notary retired or passed the practice on, that greffe eventually made its way into Quebec's provincial archives, an institution most people outside the province have never heard of, and most researchers inside it check far less often than they should. Unlike a parish register, a marriage contract almost always names the parents of both the bride and groom by name, sometimes their place of residence too. If our strongest Pepin candidate and the Lachance name Denise's family carried forward were ever formally tied together on paper, a marriage contract was the most likely place to find it. The trouble with notarial records has always been access. They're scattered across hundreds of individual notaries' archives, mostly unindexed, written in French, in legal handwriting that's a different animal entirely from a parish priest's hand. Researchers have known these records existed for decades and mostly avoided them anyway, because searching them meant browsing image after image with no way to jump straight to a name. And even where an index does exist, it usually lists a document under one surname only, whichever one the clerk who cataloged it decided was primary. A D name buried in the body text of a contract, rather than in its title or heading, would never surface in that kind of search at all. That changed this year. FamilySearch expanded its full-text search technology to French language collections in 2026, and notarial records were specifically named as one of the collection types this update was built for. Full-text search reads every word in the document image itself, not only whatever a cataloger typed into an index field, which means a name like Lachance can turn up even inside a contract filed under Pepin. As of July 2026, that expansion is still rolling out collection by collection. So I always check what's actually covered before I count on it for a specific parish or region, rather than assuming everything is already searchable. I searched Lachance and Pepin together in the same query inside that expanded French full text search. And there it was, a marriage contract from 1847 drawn up before a notary serving the Nicolet area, cataloged under the groom's baptismal surname Pepin, with no mention of Lachance anywhere in the index. But inside the document itself, in the clause identifying him, the notary had written it out in full, and I'm reading this straight off the transcription: Pepin de Lachance. I needed to see the actual document before I trusted it, not a search result describing it secondhand. So I pulled the notarial image itself and ran it through Gemini via AI Studio, the tool this show has trusted with handwriting since our very first transcription challenge. I'll say this plainly, because it's an earned opinion after doing this work for years now, not a talking point. I don't hand a document like an old French notarial hand to a general chatbot anymore. Gemini is the tool I reach for on this kind of transcription, and this document, dense legal French in a cramped 1840s hand, is exactly why. Here's the prompt I used. Quote, transcribe this handwritten French notarial marriage contract from 1847 exactly as written, preserving original spelling and line breaks. Then provide a plain language English summary of who is named, including any D names, the parents of both parties, and the witnesses, end quote. The transcription confirmed it. The groom's full identification in the contract named both his baptismal surname and his D name in the same clause, exactly the convention I'd spent the afternoon researching. His name was Elzéar Pepin de Lachance, born in that parish around 1820. His parents were named in the contract too, and one of them appeared in the Pepin baptismal records I'd flagged as our strongest candidate. That's a textbook example of what genealogists call resolution of conflicting evidence, one of the 5 elements of the genealogical proof standard, sitting right there in a single notarial clause. Before I got too excited, I did what this show always tells you to do. I checked the transcription against the primary source image myself, word by word, rather than trusting Gemini's summary at face value. Remember our golden rule: AI is your research assistant, not your researcher. The transcription pointed me to the exact clause, and it read the handwriting better than I could have on my own. But it didn't get to decide, on its own, what that clause meant for Denise's family. I made that call after reading the document myself, line by line. With that document in hand, I finally had what a parish register alone couldn't give me: one piece of paper naming both surnames for the same man in the same sentence, with his parents attached. The abrupt starting line in the Lachance records wasn't a mystery anymore. It was a family that had been living under its baptismal name the whole time, one generation away from being found, hiding in plain sight in a record type nobody had thought to check. By this point, I had parish register images, census pages, and a notarial contract scattered across 3 browser tabs and a growing folder on my desktop that was starting to look like a crime board. I needed all of it organized in one place, with the ability to ask a question and get an answer tied to an actual source, not a guest dressed up as one. That's the whole reason NotebookLM, now called Gemini Notebook, exists on this show's tool list. I uploaded every image I'd gathered and gave it this. Quote, using only the parish register images and the notarial contract I've uploaded as sources, build a single chronological family timeline for the Pepin and Lachance names in Nicolet Parish from 1750 to 1900. For every entry, cite which uploaded document it came from, end quote. What came back was the cleanest version of this family story I'd seen all day. One continuous line, not a family that appeared from nowhere in 1850. Steady baptisms under Pepin from 1750 onward, generation after generation of it. The notarial contract sitting right at the hinge point in 1847, tying both names together in one clause. Lachance baptisms picking up immediately after and continuing all the way through to the family's departure for Rhode Island. Every single line traced back to a document I could open, click through, and check with my own eyes. So here's where we stand. We now know Denise's family, the one behind that rosary, really was in that Nicolet parish for well over a century before anyone in it ever set foot in Woonsocket. We know the sudden appearance of the name wasn't a family arriving from nowhere. It was a name doing exactly what D names were built to do, and doing it a little too well for a great great granddaughter generations removed and a continent away from where it happened, holding a rosary and wondering if her grandmother had told her the truth. That's real progress, and it's more than Denise had this morning. Remember that wall I asked you to lean into back in the beginning? The one where a solid surname and a solid place still refuse to connect? This is what standing on the other side of it looks like. Not a clean answer waiting behind the wall like a prize. More wall in a different shape, only now with a door in it you finally know how to find. I told Denise the truth about that when we spoke. This kind of research rarely closes every door in one sitting. Most weeks, a genealogist opens one door and finds two more behind it. That's not a failure of the process. It's what the process actually looks like once you stop expecting it to behave like a mystery novel with a tidy final chapter. So, this isn't a full breakthrough. It's a partial answer, and I think that's honestly what genealogy usually hands you if you're doing it right. We turned a dead branch back into a living one. We didn't finish the tree, and I'm not going to dress it up as finished to give this episode a tidier ending. Here's what the evidence actually tells us. A family can be exactly where they always said they were, carrying a name they hadn't actually carried yet, and still manage to leave no trace under that name for 100 years because a nickname hadn't finished becoming a surname. If Denise's rosary could talk, I don't think it would care which spelling won. It wanted someone to notice the family behind it had been there the whole time. I keep coming back to something about this case that I think applies well beyond French Canadian research. We tend to treat a name as the most solid fact in genealogy, the one thing we can hold on to when everything else is uncertain. A date might be wrong. A place might be misremembered. But surely a name is a name. This case says otherwise. A name can be two names. It can be worn like a coat, swapped out depending on the room a family's standing in, and still belong to exactly one set of people the whole time. Once you've seen that pattern once, you start noticing it everywhere. Your homework. If you've got French Canadian ancestry, or honestly, ancestry from anywhere with a naming tradition you don't fully understand yet, before you decide your family isn't in the record at all, go find out whether your specific region or ethnic group has a naming quirk like this one. If you've got French Canadian roots specifically, look up your surname in a D name reference tool before you assume a wall means a dead end. Quebec genealogy sites maintain searchable D name pairings by surname, and it takes about 2 minutes to check whether your family's name has one on record. D names, patronymics, translated surnames. They're all doing the same thing to your research, hiding a real family behind an unfamiliar label, one you haven't learned to read yet. And for my Australian and UK listeners, this same lesson about hidden naming traditions applies directly to your own research. Australian researchers working any French, Irish, or Catholic immigrant line should check Trove for local parish and community newspaper mentions, since these sometimes record a family's official name and an unofficial one side by side. And for my English listeners specifically this time, since I know I lean on Scotland and Wales more often than I should, the General Register Office and your local county record offices are exactly where an English family's own version of this problem, an occupational by name or a locally used nickname surname, tends to turn up. Same approach, different archives. Thank you so much for listening to Ancestors and Algorithms. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you know a fellow genealogist who could benefit from what we covered today, share this episode with them. That is the best way to help our community grow. If today resonated, the companion guide takes it one step further. I include the exact workflow I use to cross-reference D names and notarial records, plus advanced prompts and a GPS research checklist built specifically for French Canadian research. The free episode stands on its own, but the companion guide is where the serious toolkit lives. For everything you need, including every episode, our private Facebook community, companion guides, and the research lab, head over to ancestorsandanai.com. It's all right there waiting for you. I'm your host, Brian, and I will see you next week for another journey into the past powered by the future. Until then, happy researching.